Yeah, I want to welcome Kennesaw Happenings podcast in the studio. We have special guests that came all the way over from Kennesaw. No, that's right. That's not that far away. So we're located close to Academy Sports, right next door, and behind QT. So the coffee, let me see. What's the name of it? Coffee place that you have your
Kennesaw Coffee Company.
Kennesaw Coffee Company, and I'm thinking of another word that they know it from
Desktop
co-working. Yes, that's it. A lot of people know desktop. So anyway, let me have them introduce yourself, introduce them to you so you know who's going to be on our show today. So ladies first, Heather, could you please introduce yourself?
Go right ahead, Heather.
Hi, I'm Heather Croas, and I don't know what else to say.
Awesome.
We'll get into Heather's story in just a
minute. We twisted her arm to come today. So I'm just joking. Okay, go ahead, Larry.
And I'm Larry Grawey, pastor Kennesaw Family Life Church, and a few other things in the community. And wanted to be on here with Pete and just talk a little bit about what we do and just kind of share Heather's story a little bit, which is a lot of fun. So
yes,
that's who we are.
Well, we pride ourselves in storytelling. So Heather, how did you come to be in this place right now? Give our viewers a little idea of the first part of your story. We'll get into, a little bit more, but tell us a little bit about how you got here today.
Okay, do you mean like in this room?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was kind of challenging. We had to go through the coffee machine. We had to go through the elevator. And we had to walk through, but just give our viewers a little framework of, just your journey to this point right here so they can understand who they're listening to.
I met this weird guy in a park in, 2016?
Somewhere in there. Yeah.
It was at the Kennesaw movie night, and I had forgotten to eat because I have a bad habit of doing that. And his church's tent was next to the Papa John's pizza. I never got the pizza, but I struck up a conversation with him, and over the next few months, I would attempt to go to his church and then run out. And then eventually, they tied me down, and I stayed for more than 2 seconds.
We didn't tie you down too much.
Well, you say that, and I know you're joking, but I want to just, because I'm familiar with the intimidation of walking through doors, because big church, I'll call it, a lot of people didn't have positive experiences. So it's very intimidating to all of a sudden walk into a strange place, because I greet. And so people have told me, like, man, when I walked in there the first time, I was like, overwhelmed. So to I want Larry to go next, and then I'll come back to you, Head. What do you say, Larry, to the people that maybe have had a discombobulated connection with church? How do you feel about welcoming them in and just talking with them and just being you?
Well, I think for anybody, a new experience is difficult. Heather's story, and that's where we want to get to in just a minute. Yeah. But one of the things that we try to do as a church, we're smaller, and we tend to try and take away the intimidation thing. Heather's background and history with church was very difficult. And that's really where her story kind of comes in, because she hadn't been in church in quite a while because of difficult experiences. And that's really where I want Heather to kind of pull out her story, because over the years, she's struggled with different social cues and social difficulties. Doesn't even really like being on camera a whole lot, so I'm proud of her this morning.
Yes.
But for somebody like Heather, who doesn't like to be touched or hugged, and I've known Heather for a long time, so I can do things like this,
Yeah.
But what do we like to do in churches? We want to come up and we want to hug everybody and visitors. And we say, hey, who's a visitor? And want everybody to raise their hand. Well, for some people, that's a very terrifying moment. We think we're being very hospitable, but what we don't realize is that's putting up the guard of the person that's there. And so we really tried to build relationship, and meeting Heather those years ago has been a long lasting relationship and journey, which led Heather and I to doing a podcast together about connections and how our connections in our lives affect our mental health, and really how every area of our life affects our mental health. And Heather does a lot with trying to help people recover from traumatic experiences, specifically around mental health and the difficulties and struggles that have been there. And so that's kind of where this journey comes in, because her experience with church in the past had been very difficult and tumultuous, even from times where building relationships and people didn't take the time to get to know her and understand where her struggles were, and ended up becoming walls and barriers to where she didn't feel welcome anymore. And so that's kind of a heart of ours. We tend to, as a church, have people that are struggling and had difficulty in church can feel somewhat at home at our church, because we're not your typical church. And I know that was a long explanation to say that.
No, it's kind of, I don't know. I don't believe in coincidences. So there was a lady that was on our podcast yesterday. She mentioned her journey, and she just she's going to be back on the 19th of March, but I talked to her yesterday and I asked her back for this reason.
Wow.
There we go. I'll let you talk, Larry, for a second. Okay, I'm good. Right. So she mentioned mental health and her journey. And so we got into her journey because she just opened up a franchise called Clean Eats. And I just, 20 minutes, you can only, tap on a little bit of a story.
Sure.
But her journey and what she told me, okay. So, but it hits you because every person's journey is unique. And I guess where I'm going with this is our 20 minutes, 30 minutes we spent together, you could tell that there was some very difficult times during that journey. So if I can shift it off to me for a second. Okay. So Heather, what would you share? Like what has been the most difficult part of your journey? So you walk into this church, or you meet Larry at the Kennesaw, what was it, Taste of Kennesaw or something?
It was a Kennesaw movie night.
Movie night. Okay. Yeah. So it was a community event.
Yes. Yeah.
So you meet this guy, and he's got gray hair, and he's a little older, and he's just kind of like probably a little weird because he's talking to everybody. What was the difficult thing about walking into a strange place like the church that Larry hosts at Desktop?
Well, they were still at Bounce U then.
Yeah, that was a little while ago. Yeah.
So it's easier to run in and out of than Desktop, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, why did you come back? Like, because I know that we often go into a place and it's like really strange, and then we just go back, we leave. Why did you come back? Because I didn't get the date, but that was back a few years ago.
Yeah.
What drew you back to come back and check it out again?
Growing up, I grew up in a very divided household. My mother is very zealous Christian. My father was somewhere between atheist and agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
But I grew up in church. I grew up around the church, and while most of my experiences were less than positive,
Mm-hmm.
I've always found myself going back. And for a long time, I walked away from God. And then I met this weird guy, and he talked to me, and he, like an actual human and not some weird creature. And I could call him randomly on the phone because he was dumb enough to give me his phone number. And I would call him when I was struggling. I didn't even know this guy, and he would like talk to me. And he kept inviting me to his church, and I was like, okay, sure, yeah, maybe. And he still teases me because he says I was like a bird flying in and out of a birdhouse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it just over time, gradually, I started to get more comfortable. And then I started to develop a relationship with him and a relationship with his wife, Jennifer, who's amazing and nicer than Larry.
This is true. This is true.
Yeah, we always have the other side to personalities, and so not that I know Larry not that long, maybe a year or so, but we've talked quite a few times, so I know he's a pretty cool dude. So okay, let's go back. So the fact that you guys had conversations, do you feel like it was beneficial to have somebody you could talk with?
Yeah, it always is. I genuinely struggle with picking up on things like social cues and the dynamics that come with interpersonal communication because people are awkward and weird and they don't recognize that they're awkward and weird.
Yep.
I happen to, I found out when I was 32 that I likely fall on what was then Asperger's and now ASD or autism spectrum.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Which honestly makes a lot more sense now than it did when I first found out. And so he never like treated me differently because of it. And when I was struggling with like things like suicidal thoughts, he didn't try to push me away. When I was utilizing poor coping skills, he didn't chastise me. He didn't condone it, but he didn't condemn it either. And
right.
So he's walked through with a lot in the last, especially few years.
Well, when you mention the word suicide, it hits hard.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that's really difficult to talk to about. I mean, because it just is. I mean, so what do you say like to people? I want to go back to one thing because I was in a class recently and it was boundaries. And this person was sharing, like you said, Larry, everybody wants to hug you and welcome you. And it's kind of like, maybe it's Southern hospitality. I don't know if that's the case, but this person said this, which kind of like really hit me, is I'm a hugger, but I know people that aren't huggers. Mm-hmm. And when you violate somebody's space and you are hugging a non-hugger, not only is it awkward, it's really, you have not respected a person's boundaries. So this person said this, when they meet somebody, they would say, hey, look, I'm a hugger. And that kind of opened the door to say, if you're not a hugger, say good. And they put their hand out and they just shook a hand, as opposed to you just jumping into somebody's face and hugging them, which that's a violation of that boundary that we all have. You hear the 3-foot rule, like, those people that just get right here and they're just... They're like, oh, wait, come on. And you're backing up because they violate the 3-foot boundary. So I want to just go back to that. Did you, like, in getting to know people at Larry's church, did you kind of set boundaries to yourself, or was it subtle, or what was that like?
Ironically, Larry set them for me and I didn't find out till years later. Because he knew. When people come up and get in my space, if I'm not comfortable with them, I shut down.
Yeah.
And somehow when you get rigid, they seem to think that's an indication you want to be squeezed tighter and not left alone.
Right.
And so Larry was kind enough to let people know, hey, look, don't come near her, don't touch her, don't look at her weird.
Yeah.
I want to preface that a little bit. And actually, there's a couple reasons why I want to share this. So Heather mentioned that when she gets in a situation, she's on that spectrum, and part of how her body copes with those situations is she shuts down.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a pretty well-known story. She will become, in a way, nonverbal vocally, but still be able to communicate through phone or writing or whatever. But the way people have handled that is they see somebody going through that. She's also got asthma, and sometimes asthma attacks will trigger these things. Everybody gets concerned and they kind of just poof right around, which actually escalates that response, especially with asthma. It would almost create a really dangerous situation. And so what I did for those in our church, again, we're a small church, so I could do it with most everybody that's there, say, hey, you know what? Heather just needs space. Give her space. I wasn't as extreme as what she said. Don't look at, but just give her space.
This is what I was told.
You're fine. But give her space. If she looks like she's struggling with things, because she has certain tics and things that come out when she's overstimulated. And what happens is we as people that aren't dealing with that, we look at it and we don't know what to do. And so what do uncomfortable people do? They either totally shun, which, for Heather, in most cases, that would probably be fine, or they awkwardly try to help. And so through a relationship with the police department, I'm a chaplain with the police department. And the police department's always been police officers have always been a point of trauma for Heather, because when a police officer is taught to take control of a situation, so they use loud verbal commands. Well, for Heather in her situation, loud verbal commands triggers that reaction that makes her nonverbal, so they think she's non-compliant, which has led to being wrestled to the ground or treated in a way that wasn't healthy. And it wasn't because she wouldn't be responsive. She literally just shut down.
Right.
And so through the Kennesaw Police Department, Chief Westenberger has great officers, and one of the officers there helped Heather develop a card that has all of the things that she deals with and instructions that if certain things are happening, please give me space. These kind of things, I'm fine. I can talk through my phone, whatever, to help with that. And it has helped her relationship with first responders, police or fire, or whoever would respond to situations, because people would see her having difficulty and they would automatically call 911, which often would escalate it into something it didn't need to be. And so this card has been a big tool to help her to be able to communicate. When she can't verbally do it, she can hand that card to somebody and say, hey, like she's gotten into mountain biking now. She's had some knee surgeries and stuff that she hasn't been able to. But, falling down on the mountain bike, people would want to come and help, which would trigger a response. And when you're in the woods, that's not a great place for that to happen. So we've learned over the years, and that's something that my wife and I, as pastors, but even as people, for anybody, you have to build relationship with somebody to know who they are. So that you know how to help them. And not everybody has the capability or skills to be able to do that, but you have to have a relationship to know where those boundaries are, to know how to respond to those situations. And I think that's what we've done well for you and for others in our church that struggle with similar things, to be able to help with that. Does that pretty much sum it up well?
Yes. And the irony is it was crashing on a mountain bike that precipitated the card.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. You always look back into different events that happen, and at the time you're not, have no idea. And then all of a sudden you almost like you put the puzzle together and you see how that puzzle was carefully put together. I never knew the word boundaries until recently. Never had heard of it. And now there's like books. There's all kinds of stuff that is out there that teaches people, like with a card, to basically, and I don't know if this is a good analogy, but you're basically giving a person your boundaries. And so by giving a person the boundaries, they are able to respect the boundaries. Without that card, there is not that respect. And I think we all have to understand that we all have boundaries in life. And this is a very easy one to understand because of how somebody would be able to relate to you. So what do you feel like after that card and after you felt you had something to communicate with, how did that make you feel to be able to have a tool that you could help people understand your boundaries?
So it's interesting because it's only been fairly recent, last few years, that I realized that it was okay to establish boundaries for myself. I've been told my whole life that there are boundaries I'm not supposed to cross with other people. There are inappropriate responses and things that I would do because I didn't know any better, because nobody taught me, and I would constantly get in trouble. But nobody explained to me that it's okay to say, hey, I don't like being touched. Hey, I need some space. Hey, I'm struggling to breathe. Can you give me a second to use the inhaler? Little things. And I actually have the card on my phone so that I can keep it updated with all the current meds. And I've had, unfortunately, more than a few incidents with first responders. And one of them actually told me, recommended printing a copy to put in my car so that if for whatever reason I can't get to my phone or the card in my wallet, they have that available. And it's something that I would recommend anybody doing, regardless if they have a disability or not, because it does make a difference. There's always going to be times when people get overwhelmed and they're struggling and they need a little bit of extra help. So
yeah, that is really good to hear. I mean, I love how you articulated that and explained it for our viewers, because I said in a different explanation, it was the second part of a class that I was taking. And I said, I geek out. Every time I get something, I have to listen to everything. So I just have to get to the bottom of something. So I hear we're going to be taking this course called Boundaries. And I'm going, boundaries? What the heck is boundaries? I've never heard of the word. But I said to the people, I think this is more important than like Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace, because without boundaries, everything gets jacked up. And the emotion that is attached to boundaries is so misunderstood. I mean, I think it's like it's almost like God's created everybody with this individual thumbprint. We're all different. And there's no like cookie cutter, like you're in the South, you got to hug people, you got to talk to people. Everybody's different. And I think the fact that you now have something that you can communicate your boundaries is incredible to hear that is the tool that can be used to help people understand boundaries. So Larry, what would you say, like, as a pastor? You obviously have heard of boundaries. I had never heard of it. And I'm 66, so I don't know what. And if you look at all my books, I probably read more books than most.
Wow.
I probably listen. I don't even have TV, so I listen nonstop. So, and I listened to at least 25 hours of boundaries since I discovered that literally 2 months ago.
Wow.
So that's a little OCD. I know it's a little over the top, but I was fascinated with the subject. The fact that when Larry said he wanted to do this, I had no earthly idea what he wanted to do. It was just like, hey, I think we have some information we would like to share with viewers. And I'm going, okay, yeah, I didn't even ask any questions, which usually I do. So let me get back. I'm getting kind of off the topic here. What do you see, Heather, now that you have your boundaries very laid out and very easy to communicate. How do you see the future? And I'm not saying 10 years, but like tomorrow, now that you have your boundaries put in such a way that you can communicate that, what is that? How does that make you feel?
And in some ways, it's like the airline speech where they tell you to put your mask on before you put someone else's on.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're not taking care of yourself, if you're not respecting your own boundaries and you're letting other people violate that, not only are you hurting yourself, you're really hurting the other person. And I don't think people get that.
I totally agree with you.
So,
I mean, that you could teach this class. I'm telling you, because that's exactly what they kept saying is boundaries are for us, not the other person. We think like we're creating this boundary for that other person. No, it's put that gas mask, or not the gas mask, the oxygen mask. We don't want to put a gas mask
conversation.
on. Yeah, that's different. But that thing about they say it on the airlines. Hey, when you that thing drops, you put it on yourself and then your person next to you. So it makes sense. But I think in boundaries, it's such a needed topic, but totally misunderstood. What do you say, Larry, to the fact, how do you see it in your church and you're working with the police department, you're working with KBA as a membership, you're obviously connected to people.
Yeah.
How do you, what do you say? Like, do you all of a sudden, that is your go-to like conversation because it's so important? How do you see it, what you do making you more effective in communicating?
Well, I think where you're going with this, when I approach a new conversation, so we have a business as well. And so I spend a lot of time with people, either we own a travel business, which we talked about the last time you and I got together, or the church. I like to do what the business world calls one-on-ones. I like to get coffee with somebody, sit down with them, get to know them. When I first meet them, if they extend a hand or whatever, we might shake hands just as a common courtesy. But I try to take the time to get to know somebody's story before I go deeper into that relationship on a one-on-one basis, or, whatever that is, to try and get to know who that person is. So I know how to respond to them and they know how to respond to me. I think everybody's individual story is important. So that's probably the pastor in me, but it's also part of who I am. And as we get to know people, what COVID did was isolate us out for a while. And now we're seeing mental health be an issue across the board. Teenagers are dealing with it. They've always dealt with it, but you're seeing it more publicly talked about more than ever. The senior population is probably the highest rise in the need for mental health conversations, because now we're finding out that isolation and not knowing how to use boundaries, all those things are causing difficulties for people emotionally. And they're struggling with that. And that's part of what Heather and I do together. Heather, and the reason I even ask you to kind of, hey, let's do this. And Heather and I have a podcast together that Pete's going to be a guest on in a few minutes. It's called 412 Connections. And what that is, it's based on Ecclesiastes 4:12, which basically talks about, if you read through that passage just before, it talks about how two are better than one. If you lie down, you can keep each other warm, you can guard each other's back, and three is better. A three-braided cord is not easily broken, which is where we came up with Ecclesiastes 4:12. And Heather started this podcast, 4 years ago now?
4th season, 3 years.
Wow.
3 years. And it started out as her way of processing the way Heather has dealt with her mental health. You mentioned suicide. We, for the last few years, have been doing, every September is Suicide Awareness Month. We do a panel where we bring in professionals and attempt survivors and loss survivors and come together and have a conversation around suicide. That's a very big deal for Heather. With her struggles, I've lost family members, my brother to suicide. And so we have that conversation in May. We're going to be hosting an event with around mental health awareness, because that's Mental Health Awareness Month. And Heather does workshops and uses art to help people process through their mental health struggles. Because everybody's got mental health. It's how you deal with it.
Yep.
And so she hosts that conversation. We've been helping her with that for several years. And the podcast, we bring in guests and we talk about how every area of our life is connected to our mental health, that overall balance. So that kind of brings you to where we're at. And that's why it's such an important topic for me, but a big reason why I wanted Heather to be a part of this and talk to you is we're trying to help people have not only set healthy boundaries, but know how to do the different areas of their life to keep themselves healthy mentally. Because our physical sides, you went through some physical struggles that affects your mental health. Your diet, how you feel, your finances, recreation, all those different areas affect our mental health. And so that's where our conversation has come together. And part of the reason why we're doing this is to make you aware of that. Now I'm going to bring it a little bit full circle. Since we met Heather in the park, and Heather, when I first met Heather, she would come into conversations, like I would surround her with community leaders because she's always wanted to do these workshops. She's got several workshops that help people process through a lot of this stuff. Trying to get her out in front of people, she would walk into a room and she'd only stare at the floor.
Well, I like shoes.
Yeah, because part of that was her self-confidence. Part of that was feeling like she belonged in that room. But over the years, I've watched Heather grow in that side of things. She's become more confident in herself and the story that she has to tell, to the point where for the last couple of years, she's been at a couple different conferences that are the church world that deal with church and how they respond to people with disabilities on different levels, whether it's physical disabilities, whether it's things like autism or other issues, helping the church. And she's been a presenter for the last couple of years. This year will be her second year at the Church and Disabilities Conference. This year it's in Orlando. Last year is in Ohio. And she gets to speak and tell pastors like, hey, here's my story. Here's my response to how I was treated when I came in the church, because the church didn't know how to respond to me. And so that was kind of, I just wanted to bring that full circle because I've been really proud of what Heather has been able to do and how God's used her life. And it's been really cool to watch her step through these doors and grow in that. She's an incredible person, like speaker. Socially, she doesn't as much like the engage on the group, like just kind of circle time, but put her up in front of people and she has an incredible gift to share that story.
It's because it's easier.
Yeah.
Well, it's I'm listening to you, Larry. My partner's up in Canada. He's autistic and he's a speaker, but when it comes to like the one-on-one interact, that's not his world. And he's said that he now understands it, but it's like we're totally opposite. Where I struggled with the mental health issue is I was dyslexic and ADHD, and ADHD is everything's going through your head, and dyslexic is I couldn't process regular words, which threw me into depression, which I'm normally outgoing, but when I get depressed, you aren't going to see me. I isolate like crazy. Now, that leads to not a very good outcome because suicide is real. I think the brain gets so discombobulated, you lose sense of reality. And I told a person the other day, we were talking about this subject. I said, if there was a gun in my house growing up or when I would go through it, I wouldn't be here today, because in 1 second, you can lose it. But I didn't have one. And my go-to was a step that would kind of like stop you from going that direction. But it was no boundaries that really creates that mental, like whatever you call it, mental health. And I actually, in my class, I told the people, because the next podcast I wanted to do was physical therapy, but I told them, no, I want to do boundaries. That's crazy that I had no earthly idea that y'all were going to discuss boundaries. It's like, it's so dear to my heart. I think boundaries is the most critical way of communicating that I think people don't understand. And it's almost like, so I love we'll collaborate, partner, whatever it is. That's a subject that hits me right in the heart. I mean, down to the core of everything. So I'll throw it to Heather. What have you felt? Because I felt talking about things has helped me. And this podcasting has gotten so much trash out of here. Do you feel like, I mean, the communicating of your story has really kind of helped you? Well, I know it has, but explain that journey of podcasting and really talking through the boundary, because autism, he's autistic. And I know that, did you get diagnosed with it at a certain time in your life, or how did you know?
I have not been formally diagnosed, but
Okay.
I was told when I was 32, a couple months after the attempt, that they suspected that I had Asperger's.
Yeah.
And then years later, after meeting several people, and they're like, stop questioning it. You're on the spectrum. And doing like the deep dive into the research to prove them wrong didn't work so well. But as an adult and as a female, it would be, and not to mention just the cost, it's not worth it to try to get a formal diagnosis.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I was just curious.
But
he didn't either.
Yeah.
He went and got a way that he could find out where he stood on that spectrum.
Right.
So do you feel like it's been very beneficial in really communicating?
Once I gained a better understanding of what it was versus what it isn't, because there's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of miscommunication.
Mm-hmm.
Autism is not a cognitive impairment.
Mm-hmm.
There are some people that also have an intellectual disability on top of autism, but majority of people that I know and from the research that I've done actually have very high IQs. They just have very low EQs.
Oh yeah. Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you brought that up. I call him brilliant. And he goes, Pete, I'm not brilliant. I'm 4 points shy of brilliance. I was going like, really? It's like, to the point, like you say, it is so, and his kids are like brilliant too, but it's like, I said, look, Jeff, you're brilliant to me. So I like how you said that, is like, that the way that we evaluate, the way we put labels on people is good and bad. And so we have to be careful how we attach things, because society puts that stereotype on that label, which may be completely wrong. And so that's so where do you what do you most look forward to as we wind down? Because I know we got to get to another podcast. I could talk on this subject all day long. So what do you most look forward to, like, in just your journey of really educating and helping people understand more about this topic?
Well, it's like Larry said, I have a variety of classes and speeches and things that I've developed, and I just want to get them out into the world and hopefully eventually get paid so I can not live with my mother, because I just can't afford not to. But I think one of the biggest things for me, and I've said this for years, I cannot change my past.
Right.
I can't go back and fix anything that has happened to me, and there's been a lot of things that should not have happened to anybody. And so if I can take those experiences and I can share them with other people, especially people that are in an authoritative position or in the church or first responders, especially the mental health and medical field, so that they get this perspective, they get like, this is what happened this is not okay that this happened. We need to do better.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can prevent someone else from going through the same stuff that I did,
Yep.
then at least what I went through had a purpose.
I love it.
You mentioned labels, and I won't go too far with this. She actually has a workshop around that premise.
That is specifically geared towards providers and people in authoritative positions. The idea is they get to experience what it's like to have a label placed on them, and I get to have fun. Not so much them, because I treat them based off of whatever their label is, based off my experiences with what those labels did to me. And then we talk about it. They get to take them off eventually, but when they have them on, it's a lot of fun for me.
So
I bet. And it makes sense that what you shared is your story is your testimony, and your story can help people, because if you're stuck in the society's label, it's almost like you're in a cage, and you can't, unless you can figure out a way to hear your story, which would encourage people to get out of that cage and get into where they can help. I love that you're serving, and we do. A lot of people don't know it, but we do podcast mastery. So we want 1,000 podcasts in 5 years.
Oh, wow.
Now, they're niche podcasts, meaning boundaries. So if boundaries is near and dear to your heart, I think we have a pathway to help in that area. And we'll talk off the air, but yeah, I'm loving it. I'm really loving it. Even though you see in the background golf, I don't do golf as much anymore, but it's what I thought I started out doing, but it drove me to senior living because I live in a place that's pretty much seniors. So as we wind down, I want to tell our viewers, how can they get a hold of you? What would be the best way to either take a workshop, listen to your podcast, give our viewers how they can get a hold of you?
Well, the podcast is primarily through Spotify. It's on a couple of other different platforms.
Mm-hmm.
If you look it up, it's on Amazon and Apple. I don't know how you access them. I just have accidentally found them.
Well, we'll put links to them in the show notes. We'll make it easy for our drivers who are out there going, man, how can I get a hold of this? We'll make sure you can. So we'll put that in there. So I want both of you to answer this question. What would you want the one thing, and we'll go to Heather first. What one thing would you want our viewers to take home with our time on this podcast?
I think the biggest thing that I want people to understand is that mental health and mental illness are not interchangeable terms. They are two sides of the same coin, but they are not the same thing. We all have mental health, and mental health affects every part of our lives, just like every part of our lives affects our mental health. It's all connected. And so we need to take care of it, and we need to reduce the stigma and start talking openly about mental health and our feelings and suicide, and take away that taboo, so that when someone is struggling, they're not afraid to reach out for help. And we recognize that when someone is asking for help, that we don't turn them away because we think they're manipulating us or playing games, because what is seen as attention-seeking behaviors, all behavior is attention-seeking. We need to figure out what need is not being met, and maybe help them find a better way to address those needs and get those needs met. But sometimes people don't know how to, and so they use behaviors that are seen as being manipulative or games, and it's very frustrating for me on both sides.
That was well said. I would want to follow that. So, but Larry, you got it.
Yeah, no.
I don't want to put you in a difficult position, but you are.
Hey, I love this.
Mm-hmm.
You see the passion that Heather has behind this because of her experience. And the one thing that I would add to that is that all of the stuff that Heather and I have done together come out of taking the time to build relationship. not force relationship, but actually you're talking about boundaries. Respect the person enough to find out who they are, what those boundaries are, and how you build that relationship. Everybody's got this bubble, and certain people are on the outside of the, on the far outside of the bubble, their acquaintances or whatever. And every level of relationship brings people closer inside that bubble. And not everybody's going to be really close. We only have 3 or 4, maybe 5 people in our lives that are in that close. I'm one of the few people that Heather doesn't mind if I do this to most of the time, because we're in that bubble together. But for most people, you can't know where that is if you don't know who the person is.
Yep.
So take the time to sit down and have coffee or a meal or whatever that is, to enjoy time with different people, so that you can get to know their story better, so that you can know who they are. It doesn't mean everybody's going to be close and intimate, but the more you know somebody's story, the better that you can speak into their life and they can speak into yours.
Awesome.
So relationship.
I love it. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Heather. We appreciate you being a guest on Kennesaw Happenings.